For 11 years, the miller at Stony Ford took his pay in grain instead of money, and never sold a bushel of it. And by the summer, the rains failed, and the whole valley stood at the edge of starving. That strange old man had a stone barn full of other people's wheat that everyone had long since stopped thinking about. And what he did with it is the reason my children were born at all. I was one of the men who called him a miser to his face. I am the one telling you this because a man ought to tell the story that shames him himself, and not leave it to be told kindly by others after he is gone. My name is Amos Kerr, and I farmed the bottomland below Stony Ford in Osage County, Kansas. And the miller's name was Bertram Kell, though for most of the years I knew him, I did not call him Bertram, or Mr. Kell, or anything a man calls a neighbor. I called him the grain miser, behind his back, and once or twice to his face. And I had what I thought were good reasons, and I was wrong about every one of them. And it took a year of no rain to teach me how wrong. You have to understand how a mill worked in a country with little money, because the whole quarrel between the valley and Bertram Kell grew out of it. There was almost no cash on that frontier in those years. A farmer grew grain, and he needed it ground into flour and meal to feed his family, and he could not eat it otherwise, and so he brought his grain to the mill. And because nobody had coin, the miller was paid the old way, the way millers had been paid for 1,000 years, by the toll. He kept a portion of every load he ground, a set share, and that was his wage. Every miller everywhere did it so, and no one thought a thing about it, because every other miller then turned around and sold his toll grain for money, or ground it and sold the flour, and turned his wheat into cash, the way any sensible tradesman turns his goods into money. That was how a miller lived. Bertram Kell did not sell his toll. That was the whole strangeness of him, and it made the valley crazy for 11 years. He took his fair share of every load, the same toll any miller took. Nobody said he cheated on the measure, but then he did not sell it. He carried it up the hill behind the mill to a great stone barn he had built, a barn with walls 2 feet thick and a slate roof and iron doors, dry as a bone and cool as a cave inside. And he put his toll grain in it, sacked and binned and cared for, and he left it there, year after year. He ground the valley's grain and took his share and hoarded it up the hill, and he sold almost none of it and lived poor as a church mouse himself on the little he needed, a lean, quiet, solitary old man in a patched coat who was making himself, everyone was sure, secretly rich, sitting on a fortune in wheat he was too miserly even to enjoy. And that is what we called him, the grain miser of Stony Ford. We said he was hoarding the valley's own bread up in that stone barn out of pure greed, waiting, we were sure, to sell it high when he could squeeze us, or just sitting on it out of the plain sickness some men have for having. Every farmer resented that barn. It was our grain up there, near enough, ground out of our loads a toll at a time, and instead of it going back into the market where it might do some good, it sat, locked behind iron doors, doing nothing for anybody, while the man who kept it wore a patched coat and said little and let us think whatever we liked. I resented it as much as any man. I had a growing family and hard years, and every bushel was dear to me, and it galled me to haul my wheat up to that mill and watch old Kell measure off his toll, knowing it was going up the hill to molder in a miser's barn, instead of being sold like an honest tradesman's wage. I will tell you the one thing about Bertram Kell that we all remarked on and mostly mocked, and then I will let it wait, because it turned out to be the key to the whole of him. The old man tasted grain. Every load that came to his mill, before he ground it, he would take up a handful and put a few kernels in his mouth and bite them, slow, with his eyes half shut, the way another man might taste wine. And then, as often as not, he would say the year. Not the kind of wheat. The year. He would say, "This is a wet spring wheat," or "This grew in a dry one," or "This came up in a hard year." I can taste the struggle in it. We thought it was an old man's affectation, a mill keeper's mystery he put on to seem wise. We would josh him about it, ask him to taste a load, and tell us our fortunes. He never minded the joshing, and he never stopped doing it, biting the grain and naming the season it had suffered or thrived in. And it was, we all agreed, the harmless, strange habit of a strange, harmless man. I understand now what he was doing. He was reading, in every single load the valley brought him, the one thing the valley itself refused to read, which was that the years were not all alike, that some were fat and some were lean, and that a country which had known a run of fat ones was overdue, always overdue, for the lean. He tasted the weather in our wheat. He was keeping count of something the rest of us had stopped counting. What Bertram Kell understood, and what no one in that valley wanted to hear, was the oldest lesson there is about grain, older than money, older than mills, old as Egypt. He knew that grain is not wealth to be spent. Grain is life to be stored. A country that turns all its grain into money the moment it has it, and keeps no store, is a country that has bet its life on next year's harvest being good. And no country can win that bet forever. Kell had come from somewhere, Bavaria, I learned much later, from people who had kept mills for generations and had seen famine, real famine, the kind that empties a village, and had learned in their bones the thing the Bible itself teaches in the story of Joseph and the 7 fat years and the 7 lean, which is that the whole purpose of plenty is to lay up against want, and that someone in every community must be the keeper of the store, or the community will feast itself right up to the edge of starvation and over. Kell had appointed himself that keeper. Nobody asked him to. Nobody thanked him for it. He simply decided, alone, that this valley would have a granary against the lean year, whether it wanted one or not. And since no one else would keep it, he would, out of his own toll, and bear the name of miser for doing it, for 11 years, without once explaining himself, because explaining, I think he knew, would have done no good at all. He said it to me once, the only time he ever answered my rudeness, and I did not understand him until years later. I had said something to him at the mill, sharp, about his barn full of the valley's bread, and asked him what he was saving it all for. And the old man looked at me and said, "For the year you are not saving for." That was all. For the year you are not saving for. I thought it was more of his millwright's mystery, and I took my flour and went home sore, and I did not think about it again until the year came that I had not saved for, and then I thought about it every day for the rest of my life. Now, Kell was strange, but he was not a fool, and I will not pretend his hoarding was flawless from the start, because it was not, and the flaw in it nearly ruined the very thing he was trying to build. In the early years, before I knew him, the story went that his first great store of grain was lost, most of it, because he had kept it poorly, binned it damp in an ordinary wooden shed, and it had heated and spoiled and been ruined by weevil and mold. A whole barn's worth of toll grain gone to rot. And the valley had laughed itself sick over the miser who had hoarded up a fortune only to let it spoil. It was a real failure, and it cost him years. But Bertram Kell was the kind of man who learns from a ruin, and he did not quit hoarding. He changed how he hoarded. He built the great stone barn, thick-walled and slate-roofed, to hold off the heat and the damp, and he learned to dry his grain properly before he binned it, and to turn it, and to keep it cool and sealed against the vermin, so that grain would keep in that barn for years without spoiling, sound and alive, and fit even for seed. What had looked like a miser losing his hoard to his own greed was in truth a keeper learning, at bitter cost, the hard craft of keeping. And by the time the lean year came, he had 11 years of sound, dry, living grain built up behind those iron doors, because he had failed once and learned instead of quitting. By the time I am telling you of, the stone barn on the hill was fuller than anyone outside its doors knew, and I will tell you honestly what it looked like to the valley, because I looked at it that way myself for years. It looked like the monument of a miser. It stood up there above the mill, blank and thick and locked, holding what everyone was sure was a rich man's secret fortune in wheat, kept from the market and the good of the valley by the sickness of a solitary old man who wore a patched coat and had no wife and no child and no friend and nothing in his life, we thought, but the cold pleasure of having. We pitied and resented him in equal measure. Not one of us, in all those fat and easy years, ever once said the thought that would have made sense of the whole thing, which was, what happens to this valley in a year when the crop fails, and where would we be then, without that barn? We did not think it, because the crop had not failed in a long time, and we had let ourselves forget that it ever could. The year it failed, the rains simply did not come. It began like any dry spell, and we told ourselves that was all it was, the way people do. The spring came dry, and the rains that should have come in May came thin, and then not at all. And the wheat came up, and then stopped, stunted and pale. And the corn curled in June, and the creeks fell. And still we told each other it would break, that a good rain would come and save the crop, the way we always told each other. It did not break. The drought settled over the whole of that country and stayed the entire season, and by the time we could no longer pretend, it was too late to matter. The crop was lost, the whole valley's crop, wheat and corn together, burned up in the field to nearly nothing, the worst failure anyone in Osage County could remember. And a failed crop, I learned that year, is not the end of the trouble. It is the beginning of it. Because a farmer who harvests nothing has nothing to eat through the winter. And worse, far worse, he has no seed to plant the next spring. And a farmer with no seed is not just hungry for a year. He is finished. He cannot start again. The failed crop of one year reaches out and kills the next year too, and the year after, unless somewhere, somehow, there is seed. The drought did not care that we had forgotten the barn on the hill, but the barn was about to remind us. Now I will tell you how it went in that valley, in the black months of that failed year, because I lived it, and I have never told it without my voice going unsteady, old as I am. By the fall it was plain that the valley was facing not just a hard winter, but ruin, the kind that empties a country. Families had no bread and no money to buy any, and there was little enough to buy, for the failure was everywhere, and the price of grain went up past what a ruined farmer could dream of paying. And worse than the winter's hunger was the spring's despair, because even the families who might scrape through the cold on charity and credit had no seed wheat, none, having eaten their seed or never grown it, and without seed the spring planting would not happen, and the next year would fail before it began, and the valley would empty, its people walking off their claims defeated, the whole settlement dying, not in one year, but in the slow, certain way a country dies when it has no seed to put in the ground. And then, that fall, Bertram Kell opened the iron doors of his barn. I was there the day the word went round, and I will not forget it. The old man came down from his mill, the miser, the grain hoarder we had resented for 11 years, and he let it be known, quietly, in his few words, that any family in the valley that needed grain to eat through the winter could come to his barn and have it, and that any farmer who needed seed wheat to plant in the spring could have that too, sound seed, the best in the county, out of his 11 years' store. And he was not selling it at the famine price that would have made him the richest man in Kansas. He was not selling it at all, not to those who could not pay. He gave it to the hungry for nothing, and to those who could manage something, he took a fair price, or a promise, or a note against a better year. And to every farmer who came, he measured out seed wheat with his own hands, good living seed he had kept dry and sound for exactly this, and told them to plant it and pay him back a share whenever the good years came again, if they came, and if they did not, then not. The barn that we had called a miser's fortune turned out to be the only thing standing between that valley and the end of it. There was grain enough in Bertram Kell's stone barn, 11 years of patient, hoarded toil, to carry the hungry families of Stony Ford through that winter, and, more than that, to seed the whole valley's fields the next spring, every farm, so that when the rains came back, as they did the following year, there was seed in the ground to catch them, and a crop came up, and the valley lived, because one strange old man had spent 11 years being called a miser for keeping the one thing that could save it. I promised I would make the plain sense of it clear, and it is the oldest sense there is, and we had all simply forgotten it in the fat years. A community that stores no grain is a community one bad harvest away from death, and it does not matter how rich its good years are, because you cannot eat a good year that is already past, and you cannot plant money. Grain is the only thing that is both food and seed, both the life of this year and the life of the next. And a country that keeps none in store has bet everything on the weather, and the weather does not keep promises. Bertram Kell had not been hoarding wealth. He had been keeping the valley's insurance, its granary, its store against the lean year that the Bible and every old country and all of human history could have told us was coming, and did come. He turned his toll not into money, but into a reserve, and he kept that reserve at his own cost and his own loneliness and under our contempt for 11 years, because he understood, as we did not, that someone must, that a people who will not store against disaster will be saved, if they are saved at all, only by the one odd soul among them who is willing to look like a miser in the good times so that there would be bread in the bad. He was not our miser. He was our Joseph, keeping the granary of Egypt against the 7 lean years, and we had called him greedy for it every day of the 7 fat ones. Mind, it did not make him rich, and it did not even quite make him thanked, and I have to tell it that way, because that is the truth of it, and Bertram Kell would want the truth. He gave away or lent out on unpayable promises the labor of 11 years, and he ended that famine poorer than he began it, an old man who had spent his one accumulation to save people who had scorned him. And many of those notes and promises were never paid, because the people who owed them stayed poor, or moved on, or simply forgot, the way people forget a debt to a man they had gotten used to despising. He did not press them. He did not put on airs of the Savior, or lord it over the valley that had mocked him, or ask for the apology he was owed. He went back up to his mill and took up his toll again, a share of every load, and began, quietly, at past 60 years of age, to fill his barn all over again from the start, against the next lean year, the one after this one, that he knew as surely as he knew anything would come someday too, whether he lived to keep the door of the barn against it or not. That was the measure of him. He saved us, and was not much thanked, and simply began again. Some of us did understand, at the end, what he had been, and I was one, too late to give him much, but my changed heart. I went up to the mill the spring after the rains came back, with the first good load I had grown from his seed, and I tried to say to him what a man can hardly say, that I had called him a miser for 11 years, and he had kept my children alive, and that I was ashamed to the bone of it. And Bertram Kell took up a handful of my new wheat, the wheat grown from his seed in the year the rains returned, and he put a few kernels in his mouth and bit them slow, with his eyes half shut, the way he always had. And he said, "This is a good year's wheat, Amos. You can taste the ease in it." And then he looked at me and said the only thing he ever said about all of it, which was, "Save some of it." And that was the whole of my absolution and the whole of his sermon, 3 words: save some of it. And I have saved some of every harvest of my life since, and so have my sons, because I taught them why, and told them about the old man and his barn. The valley learned. That is the one happy thing, and it is a real one. After that year, no one in Osage County ever called Bertram Kell a miser again, and more than that, the valley took up his wisdom as its own. Farmers began to keep their own stores against the lean years, real stores, and not to sell every bushel the moment the price twitched. And in time, the community built a proper granary of its own, a public store against hard years, run honestly, and it was old Kell they asked to advise on the keeping of it, the drying and the turning and the sealing that he had learned at such cost. And he taught them, glad to, in his few words, and the thing he had done alone and been scorned for became a thing the whole valley did together and was proud of. He had not just saved us the once. He had taught us, finally, to save ourselves, which is the greater gift and the harder one, and the one we had refused to learn from him for 11 years, until a year of no rain made us ready to hear it. I am very old now, older than Bertram Kell was the year he opened his barn, and I have kept a store of grain against the lean year every year of my life since. And the lean years have come, as they always do, and I have met them with bread in the bin and seed for the spring. And so have my children on their own places, and I have told them all why, and told them the old man's name. People hear the story, and they think it is about a clever miser who turned out to have a heart. And it is not that. Not quite. It is about a man who understood, when no one else would, that plenty is a trust and not a prize, that the whole meaning of a good year is to prepare for a bad one, and that in every community someone has to be willing to be the keeper of the store and to bear being misunderstood for it, because the store must be kept whether or not anyone is grateful, and the lean year always comes. Bertram Kell kept our granary for 11 years while we called him a miser, and when the rains failed, he opened it and saved us and asked for nothing, and taught us at last to keep our own. You cannot make the rains come, but you can store against the year they do not, and someone must. And blessed beyond all the thanks he will ever get is the one who does. Now, this valley and these people are ours, but here is what is true. Frontier mills really were paid by the toll, the miller keeping a fixed share of the grain he ground because hard money was scarce. And the storing of grain against years of failure is among the oldest and most essential practices of every settled people. From the granaries of ancient Egypt in the Bible story of Joseph and the 7 lean years, to the community granaries of old Europe. Grain, kept dry, cool, turned and sealed against damp and vermin in a good stone granary, can be stored soundly for years and remain fit even for seed, while grain kept carelessly spoils to heat, mold, and weevil, exactly as told here. Drought and total crop failure were a real and recurring terror on the plains, and their deadliest consequence was often not the winter's hunger, but the loss of seed grain for the following spring, which could finish a farm and empty a settlement. The wisdom that a community must keep a reserve against the lean year, and that plenty exists to provide for want, is as old and as true as any our species has. The miller and the valley are imagined. The toll, the granary, the famine, and the ancient duty of the keeper of the store are exactly as they were.